Okay, hi everyone. I think it's time we begin. We're obviously on a schedule, and really thank you for taking the time to come and join this webinar. This is the fourth episode in our Community Action Network series, focusing on co-governance webinars. We host these sessions monthly on the last Wednesday of every month. These webinars are a space for local community organizations to learn how to expand some of the work they do and learn from others. I am Jonathan Erasmus, the project manager of the Community Action Network, an initiative of OUTA. If you have any questions for the panel, please make use of the chat and Q&A functions, and we will get to as many as possible in the last 15 minutes. Please also take the time to introduce yourself in the chat. Tonight, we are talking about taking control of your neighborhood through various precinct management options available. Precinct management is obviously not a new concept. It has been utilized in business districts for decades. However, there is a growing interest in applying this approach to residential and mixed-use areas, especially as urban decay becomes more prevalent in many towns, villages, and cities. Yet, the solution for each area may vary significantly. As is the case in many communities, they may opt for a formalized structure of voluntary contributions, aiming to use the funds to enhance their neighborhoods. Alternatively, they might seek investors to repurpose derelict apartment blocks into affordable housing, aiming to combat urban decay. Or as in the case of Durban, Cape Town, various other municipalities, they may opt for a special rating area as outlined in the Municipal Property Rates Act. To help us unpack this, we have three excellent speakers. We have Lusanda Netshitenshe, who is the CEO of Tough 21, an organization that is driving real development impact in South Africa's townships and inner city areas. We also have Gary Cullen, a project manager at eThekwini Municipality, who is instrumental in shaping urban precinct management policies in Durban. And finally, Michaela Donaldson, the chairperson of the Gauteng Precinct Management Association and a business manager at Local Abode, which focuses on sustainable urban development. But let us start with Lusanda. Tough is a unique type of finance company as it particularly focuses on inner city regeneration through the repurposing of buildings into housing projects. It has an interest in areas facing urban decay. In Durban, I know of several such projects that proudly display the Tough logo outside, and I am aware that Tough funds entrepreneurs that typically may not be funded by the predominant financial houses. So, Lusanda, perhaps you can unpack this for us as further why and how Tough exists and its vision of the future, and how ordinary people can get involved in changing their neighborhoods for the better.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for that kind introduction, and thank you for obviously the invitation to participate in this important topic. Tough, as you correctly says, finances property developers in inner city areas and townships around the country. We have been formed, now I think in June we turned 21 years old, so we've been around since 2003. We have offices in all the major metros in South Africa, with our head office being in Johannesburg. We fund in most provinces except Northwest, Limpopo, and Mpumalanga for now, because we believe in focusing on provinces or areas that have multi-sector economies to be able to attract a diverse tenant base for our clients. We obviously focus on an outcome of affordable housing. So our finance is provided to developers who want to repurpose buildings, refurbish buildings, convert buildings from one use, usually in the inner cities is from office or light industrial into affordable housing. Part of our focus in inner cities is, of course, the attempt to try and regenerate inner cities, especially the city of Joburg. You've seen, over the years since big business moved out, that's when we started over 20 years ago, just trying to bring in some economic activity into those inner city areas. In townships, the focus is really just on densification of those areas. As you know, from the past. Townships are a little bit outside areas of economic opportunity, and there's sort of a little bit of sprawl happening with the low density use of those areas. So we try to promote densification in townships. Part of our focus is, of course, to stimulate local economic development, to contribute to job creation, which we have done, I think, quite successfully over the past 20 plus years. But more importantly, I think, which is important for this conversation, is our focus on fiscal impact. So by financing a building that was run down in the inner city of Johannesburg, as an example, repurposing that and being able to let it to rent-paying tenants, you are then able to contribute to the payment of rates to the city. And the idea is that as rates become paid to the city is then able to use that money that comes into its fiscus to invest in infrastructure, maintain infrastructure in inner cities, and manage the process of urban renewal together with the private sector. This hasn't really been successful, as we obviously have come to know, which is why we have had this formation of the many urban management efforts driven by the private sector over the years. So in terms of the question for the webinar today, or whether or not precinct management is the answer to urban decay, I think the answer is yes and no, in that it is yes, because you are able to then bring in private sector balance sheets, private sector interest, to start taking control of specific areas where they are invested. But the private sector can't do this alone, because the private sector can't enforce bylaws, for instance. It can't take the role of the municipality, which they still have to play. And some of the key functions, like collecting rubble on dates that pick it up, as an example, in Johannesburg has to do it, still has to be done by the city. And if they're not doing that, it becomes problematic. Investing and maintaining in public infrastructure is a city function which private sector can't really take on, because it's expensive. But we're starting to see more and more private sector interest in trying to, for instance, adopt parks, because there's simply no service from that point of view coming from the city. So I think that the question therefore is that it's no, in that the municipalities can't be absolved of their responsibility to manage the urban environment. And in areas where you have a lot of low to moderate income households living in those spaces, we find that service delivery is even more compromised. I mean, in the inner city of Johannesburg, we see this. I had opportunity to live in Durban since between 2009 and 2015. And just in that short period of time, when I first came between 2009 and 2010, the CBD of Durban seemed to be better managed than Johannesburg. But by 2011, by the time I left in 2015, I started seeing myself physically the decline that was starting to show in areas like Albert Park, etc. And that just speaks to the inability of the various municipalities to keep up with their side of this requirement. So I think that co-governance is key in solving this, that we need to find ways to partner with the city and bring in solutions together. But, our experience over the years in trying to co-govern is that it's been a one-way street most of the time. So we will make the attempt to reach out to the city, and the city usually will not be consistent in its intentions to partner and collaborate with private sector players. But I think there's no doubt that the investment of private sector players in the inner city of Johannesburg, of Durban, at least we've seen in other CBDs, Gqeberha, where we operate, has been a game changer in ensuring that there's a level of urban management and normality, or some sort of decent living conditions in those areas. But we still deal with the wicked issues of crime, we still deal with the issue of dysfunctional inner cities, simply because, as I say, we're not always be able to bring in the public sector to consistently participate. What we have tried to do over the years as a financier in the space is to try and encourage our clients to find buildings in a targeted precinct and try to buy buildings in the same block so that they can take some sort of control of that particular block. But that strategy doesn't always work well because it depends on the availability of buildings in a particular node. And investors take opportunity where opportunities come. So sometimes you find that precinct approach where you try to get all your affordable housing stock within a defined node is not always possible. But where we can, we push for that approach. But another approach that we try to push for is to encourage our clients, who are the landlords, to participate and pay contributions to a CID in the particular area where their building is. We've seen that our clients who have bigger, portfolios are usually more consistent in their contributions to that. But affordable housing is a very marginal business. So smaller sort of developments or clients that are starting out sometimes battle to keep up with the contributions for urban management efforts. And obviously they try to avoid passing that cost to their tenants. So you find that it becomes a little bit erratic for smaller clients to contribute. And usually those clients might have stock in areas like Bertram's, Yeoville, I'm using Johannesburg as an example. And CIDs we've tried to support in those areas haven't always been as successful simply because there's no consistency in those contributions. But also, of course, what we see is that it works better in an area where there's a large anchor commercial contributor, like for instance in Braamfontein you have Wits, you have Liberty, you used to have Anglo in Johannesburg in the Marshalltown area. So when you have a large anchor corporate who's able to contribute to that urban management effort, it's obviously usually first price. We saw the challenges of that in Yeoville when Nando's, for instance, moved out of Rocky Street. Today, Rocky Street is in fact, it's shocking to go there. It's in fact quite sad to see what has happened to Yeoville over the years. We also try to fund directly some community-led urban management efforts. We have about 2 that we are supporting financially. One is in the sort of Eastern Gateway, the Bertram's, Lawrenceville area in Johannesburg. It's called the Makers Valley Partnership. And that partnership is driven by the community itself, where you have urban rangers taking on the responsibility and role of trying to clean, ensure safety, take care of sort of public spaces, etc. But that work is quite intense because we have to organize the community and ensure that lines are not blurred as to who's accountable and who's supposed to pay what for what service. And those who are volunteering in the process, that process is not always consistent because, where there's no payment, people are looking for jobs. It's difficult to keep them committed to the process. But the rangers that we pay, we've seen a big difference in the work that they do, both in Makers Valley and in the Windsor area. We do also, try to support some CAPEX for some of the CIDs that are active. For instance, the transport district in Joburg, we support that transport improvement district with at least done it once or twice with some sort of CAPEX investment. And we try to do more of this, but we obviously are not able to take on this function because it's a city function, it's a municipal function. We don't have deep pockets and we don't really have funders who are willing to provide grant funding because it needs grant funding. You can't use debt funding, which is what we are able to raise for our affordable housing investments. So, as I said, I think earlier, to conclude is that co-governance is very important. That's the only way you can make precinct management work. You need both the private sector and the public sector, the municipality being active in that space. You need the municipality to be consistent in its ability to enforce bylaws, maintain infrastructure and do the basics that it needs to take care of. And you need some sort of structure to incentivize landlords or communities to participate in this process. Because when it's voluntary, which is usually the ones that we are involved in, it's not always easy to keep the budgets going, and that can undermine the sustainability of that urban management effort, because once you run out of money, as they say, no money, no mission, you know. So once you run out of money, Yeovil CID that we started, you know, died a slow death. I think simply because firstly, the municipality failed that area completely, and some of the landlords just started getting overwhelmed and weren't able to continue contributing. So that effort hasn't been as successful. But as I say, there's been some success stories that we can share, Makers Valley Partnership and Windsor being one of them. And definitely there is a role for private sector involvement in urban management from that point of view. But I think I'll leave it at that for now, and then, yeah, take questions.
Thank you very much, Lusanda. That was a fascinating discussion, and I know our Joburg can focus certainly to be interested in what's happening in Windsor from what you've mentioned there. I am now going to bring in Gary, and I think Gary might even answer or assist with some of the problems posed by Lusanda earlier, particularly about the kind of the voluntary payment issue. Gary has extensive experience in helping set up special rating areas in eThekwini. While the municipal policy for setting up an SRA differs from municipality to municipality, an SRA, as far as I understand, Gary, is a legislative mechanism for property owners in a geographic area to institute formal precinct management in collaboration with the municipality. But that's where my knowledge stops on this. So perhaps, Gary, if you could come on and just explain to us the purpose of an SRA, how it is structured, and I think really the big question a lot of people want to know is it right for their community? Yeah, Gary, please look forward to your insights. Okay, we seem to have we have lost Gary for the time being. I think we may have an issue there. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to ask Michaela to come in next. Michaela,
I'm here. So sorry, Jonathan, I am here.
Okay,
I was
great.
doing that old man thing, talking on mute. So if I can just try and start again. So I wanted to say thank you very much for the invitation and opportunity to talk on this forum, and greetings to everybody else present. Perhaps if I could just share my screen. I've got a few simple slides just to help us follow what I'm saying, if I may. And as I'm sharing, I think the first thing I'd like to just say very much is that, is it Lusanda? I think everything you said, I 100% support and agree with, and it fits very, very well with the kind of thinking that I'm hopefully representing here. The one point that I'd like to make, and this is about the fact that it really is needing to be about co-governance. You know, I think the nature of our entire society is that the state cannot cope alone. And there are a lot of things just about not getting your act together, but it's also just about the transformation. If I just take eThekwini, Durban as a case in point, you know, the rate space hasn't grown very much from what it used to be when it was a few small white enclave areas funding out of a budget. Well, now you've got a massive area of 90 kilometers long, 35 kilometers wide, huge expanses of rural area which have no rates generating capacity, and that same budget is spread. Other point, and I don't want to sound like an apologist, but you know, I work in an organization of 23,000 people. So when one talks about the city, you're not talking about a tight organization with a strong CEO driving a thing. You're talking about 220 councillors, a management that's broken up into siloed organizations, electricity, water, etc., which fiefdoms that go back for 100 years and don't talk nicely to each other. So when you talk about the city responding, you're often talking about small sections in the parks department, whatever, needing to do their thing and not managing very well. So that is the context, very much so. Just to get into it, I think Jonathan made the point that precinct management, and particularly in the form of what's generally called city improvement districts, is an international phenomenon. It's been going on for many decades. And in some countries, it's very much more established than here. I remember going to a SAPOA event a few years ago, you know, and there were presentations from the UK. They were talking about hundreds of organizations in the States and Canada likewise. So it's a very big movement. Typically, I think if you look in the first world context, it would have been inner cities where, you know, the nature of the cities moved, and old parts of the inner city or industrial areas, which are now completely derelict and vacant, have been turned around. I mean, I don't know a lot, but I mean, an example that stands out in my mind is Canary Wharf in London. You know, that's typically that kind of urban regeneration development. So that's a lot of where it's happened, where community and private sector role players have come to the party and created these entities, which do need partnership with local government. I think here that, you know, obviously the trend in our city is driven a lot by security and service issues, and to say that the SRA is one model amongst others, it's not the only one, and it's not necessarily the only appropriate one, but it's circumstances dependent. The way it happens, and certainly here I'm going to talk about here, is that it depends on the municipality to apply it. Gauteng, due to a court challenge of a bylaw some years ago, and I think it's been alluded to, essentially have a voluntary funded model there, which is, and Cape Town have many, 50 or something. We have 13 or 14. So the big player in this field is Cape Town. Just to, you know, the thing about the SRA model is that it is provided for in the legislation, and that provides the funding mechanism. And that's the key element of what the SRA system is. So it's provided for in the Property Act, and essentially that empowers municipalities to establish SRAs. The words are to improve or upgrade an area. And it describes that there must be a consultation process. It also talks about, you know, if it's being established, that the municipality then should establish a committee to consult the community. The way it's been applied here, and I think in other places as well, is that we haven't gone and established consultative committees, but we've in fact put the onus on communities who are interested to lead the process and apply to the municipality to establish an SRA. So that's the way it happens here. A group of people come together, could be over a beer on a Friday night, they decide to do something, they develop a plan, put a budget, consult through in Durban, quite an overly elaborate process, I'll say, and they have to obtain a consent by a voting process. The municipality then accepts the application and makes the establishment. So there's a timing process. It has to be in here by November in order that it can be included into the annual rates budget, which is effective from July. And that's because this SRA rate is in fact a supplementary rate. It's a tax. So it's collected in a formal way. And that's the biggest advantage, I think, of the system, is that the municipality, by decision of the majority, collects from everybody equally in relation to the value of their property. So 100% of liable owners will contribute to the budget and therefore the implementation of the plan. There is an alternative system called internal municipal service districts in terms of a different piece of legislation, which is a route that Shwane has gone. I don't know much detail, but I do know that they put that system there. But ultimately, it comes down to very much the same kind of thing. Just to, I think it was what a SRA can do. So firstly, I think, and most importantly, is it provides a representative organization within the community, and a community being a demarcated geographic space. And by having that organization that's of the area, it's represented, it's funded, it's been through a public process, you've got a standing that no sort of voluntary organization quite has. And so the opportunity for the community to represent itself and act in an organized way, I think, is, to me, maybe the most important element. Secondly, and this speaks to the points Lysanda was making, is that I think from that organized presence, and I would say this is essential that an SRA does, is that then it holds the municipality to account to deliver its basic services. The law says municipalities are constitutionally obliged to develop a basic municipal service. So that's not bells and whistles, it's cut the grass in the most basic way. If you can't afford to trim the edges and do the weeding, well, you don't, you'll just drive a brush cutter over it. But nevertheless, there's a basic service. And the first action of an SRA, I believe, is to ensure that the appropriate portion of service comes to the area. The second aspect, and again, this is about engagement with the municipality, is around the enforcement of bylaws, which could relate to public nuisance behavior, loitering, illegal business operations, illegal property developments, and numerous other things. So that's the second key thing. The third, and I'm drawing a distinction here in my next two bullets, is that to provide a supplementary service, in other words, a top up to municipal services, i.e. more grass cutting and so forth, as opposed to what I would call additional services, which is security as an example. Security is not a municipal service. Municipal service is not obliged to hire security companies to provide a service in your area, whereas it's a big part of what precinct management organizations do. And it can be applied across all types, in industrial, commercial, mixed use, and residential. In our situation, I'm not sure about other cities' policies, but residential requires a 66% plus one vote, and commercial is 50% plus one. If we have a mixed area, we would sort of count the residential component as one and the commercial as another. That does afford the opportunity for that initiative when it constructs its plan to say that we're going to get 50% of our plan from residential, and that means that when you work it out, given their number, they will contribute this kind of what we call a rate randage, which I'll speak to just now, and business will contribute this. So you could get a weighting where business contributes relatively more. Otherwise, you'll find that commercial properties anyway are valued much higher, so their contributions will be greater anyway. Pros and cons. So, the big advantages: the representative body, all people, all property, liable property. So schools, churches, NGOs, and certain things like that, welfare, are not liable, but your privately owned properties generally are what's liable. Municipality properties also not liable. So all of the liable contributors contribute equivalently or proportionately to the budget, which is different to a neighborhood watch, for example, where some people contribute, others don't, and you get funder fatigue, and it gets difficult to maintain, particularly a contracted service, because you need security of your income and you can't afford to have people not contributing. So that's a big factor. And then secondly, in I think all of the systems, but certainly the way it works here, is that having collected the money, we then establish a finance agreement with that SRA management company and pay the monies back over to them to implement their plan and control their budget. We exercise a governance and control function to make sure these public funds are being used properly, but we don't. It's in the hands of the owners. And as I say, engage the municipality to deliver. I think I probably need to rush on a bit. The limitations, it's a voluntary driven association. Generally, directors don't get paid, so it is dependent on that. We have issues where, there's now resources in a community where this community has been at war with each other, divided halfway down the middle for 5 years, and all they're fighting over is the control of the guard boom and hut at the entrance to the community. So you do have those kinds of issues. It is subject to municipal governance, which can be sometimes not always that effective and a bit bureaucratic. And it is more difficult to apply in low property value and lower income areas, though I think with creativity, it's not impossible. In Durban, I think a typical scenario would be, and this might apply in other places, about 65% would get spent on security, and that's security of the public rail money, to say, not supplementary to my private home security. A portion on cleaning and greening, and then admin management, employing managers, management company, and so forth. In Durban, the smallest one is a residential community of an annual budget of about 500, and they go up to about 8 million. I know the central one in Cape Town, I think some years ago, was in the 50-something million. So, it really depends on the nature of the area and the value of the property. And so this rate is an independently calculated thing. It's not a percentage of your normal general rates, but equivalently, they can range between around 9 and 20 and 25%, maybe even less than 9. I'll give you this example, and this happens to be the area in which I live, which is a residential area. It's quite a big SRA in terms of numbers of properties, but we have a monthly budget of around 300,000 Rand of the SRA on a property value of 3 billion. Fortunately, we have one big property worth 300 million, so that helped a lot. But on that, per million Rand of property, we're getting 83 Rand a month. So actually, that's not bad if I compare it to my normal rates and other kinds of costs that I'm paying. What we're getting for it, I think, is not bad. Though not everybody agreed when we established that it was a good idea. So I think a sort of a general approach that's kind of happening is in security, more and more of a movement towards a monitored number plate recognition camera, and then other sort of overview sort of movement on the streets cameras, supported by dedicated patrol and armed response services. Some have either or with boom huts and guards, and in some cases there's street monitors who kind of formalize car guard type situations in commercial areas. And the cleaning tends to be about sidewalk edging, sweeping, cleaning, supplementary cleaning, fixing up around tree boles, that sort of basic kind of beautification, plant beds, and then improving parks and passive areas just by adopt-a-spot greening and so forth. So that's kind of generally, I'm concluding now. So I think, if you happen to be in an area, investigate whether your municipality has a precinct management policy. I think in areas where they don't, maybe the question, I don't know the answer to this, is whether the enabling legislation in any way enables one to try and take an initiative and then work with the municipality in absence of them having a policy. But that's a question for a lawyer to decide. And then certainly if there's anything anyone would like to ask me about in follow-up, my email is visible there, so you could take it down and get hold of me. Thank you, Jonathan, and everybody for paying attention. I hold it back to you. And I'll stop sharing if I...
Thanks, Gary. That was great. Thank you very much. Yeah, those kind of those finer details are the thing that I think is quite important. And one of the interesting points that you hit on there was the lack of such a thing in Gauteng. I think that's obviously quite a serious issue, and I think that really brings me into the next guest, who's Michaela Donaldson, who deals with CIDs as they are commonly known in Gauteng. So Michaela, perhaps you could just take us through the reasons for the lack of the SRA in Gauteng, but also unpack the alternatives available and how communities can access them. Thank you.
Sorry, one moment, was just finding my mute button and video. And I don't think I'm going to be able to pull up my slides, but I will speak to them. It seems that I needed to restart the whole process for my slide sharing to be enabled. Sorry about that. So I think just to start with, I think a lot of what has been expressed already by Lusanda and Gary, none of it is not coming from a different side of the world. We're all very much in agreement that a lot of what we're talking about here is public-private partnership, and having mechanisms and enabling either legislation or policy that's really enabling communities to work more closely with their municipalities, to have a mechanism to understand the nuance of their particular neighborhood and start engaging on solutions that are going to have an impact for those neighborhoods and communities. So I think just to start off with, I'll go into a little bit of the context and discussion on the SRA in Johannesburg specifically, and where we are as a metro and whether that's a viable option, and some of the limitations around that. So I think quite critically, what has, in terms of the way that an SRA works, I think Gary has gone through that quite extensively. And I think that doesn't necessarily change drastically from one metro to another. But within the context of Johannesburg, our SRA policy was approved in 2019. Obviously, that was at the time that we were going into COVID, so a lot of waiting, and realistically, the challenge that we've faced is that although we've got the policy, the mechanism for implementation wasn't necessarily kind of formulated or approved at the same time. So there was question as to where the appropriate space was for that implementation to take place, whether it be a special unit within the city, which is the context of Cape Town, where they actually have a dedicated unit who's dealing with SRA establishment, whether it would sit with Treasury. And the reality is we haven't really answered that question yet. In the interim, we are working with the city to test and do a case. So there's about 3 different current voluntary improvement districts that are going to be going through the test case with the city to understand the nuance of it and unpack what it will actually take to establish an SRA within the context of Johannesburg. So it's a bit of a trial and error at the moment of trying to now say, how do we translate this policy in the context of Johannesburg? Some of the challenges that we're facing quite critically is, although, and Gary mentioned it, the biggest footprint at the moment of SRAs is in Cape Town. That is over 20 years of them getting the finance mechanism correct, of getting that process of rates being collected and then paid over to the SRA correct. And in the context of Johannesburg, we're still having billing issues with the most basic of our rates within areas, people contesting the municipal value, contesting their rates, contesting the billing. So it's quite a fractious space to now be adding an additional levy, as well as a burden of the city to pay that money to an external body. So that poses some concern within the context of Johannesburg. The question of rateable property, Gary had mentioned the fact that there are certain properties, churches, government-owned properties that are non-rateable properties. There are certain areas where you have large portions of government-owned land, government-owned property. In those contexts, that means that those are exempt. How do you now get to a budget? And they can, very often be areas where that is actually a massive impact on the viability of that area. Lusanda has mentioned some of the areas within the inner city. We've got areas within city and suburban where we've got massive amounts of government-owned property. And if they're not going to be contributing to the solution, how is it going to be sustainable for that to actually be implemented as an SRA? So that's one of our really big concerns. The other, within the context of Johannesburg, is because of the expectation on the city to pay to this entity, they require a 95% up payment. So that area for consideration, those properties need to be paid up on their rates and taxes. So you have to have at least 95% of those properties paying their rates and taxes. And if we're looking at the areas where this is really necessary, that may not necessarily always be the case. And Gary had indicated the restrictions of this in kind of low income or areas where you don't necessarily have large commercial tenants that are going to be able to help balance those things out. So a lot of what is going to make an SRA sustainable is what makes a voluntary management initiative sustainable. We are starting to ask the question in Johannesburg whether this is a structure that makes more sense for a residential neighborhood than it actually does within the CBDs and within our core inner city areas, because the reality is you'll most likely be able to do this in suburban neighborhoods. People are paying their rates and taxes. Having a one property, one vote in that context is not really going to be something that's going to have contention, because part of what you're also saying is within the SRA in Johannesburg, each property has a vote. So if you have a sectional title property, and let's say hypothetically that building is worth 10 million, and within that SRA, they neighbor a commercial property which is worth 100 million, that 100 million rand property is getting one vote, and that sectional title gets 30 votes because there's 30 units in that building. So that can also be a contention in making it sustainable in a mixed use space, because inevitably when it comes down to that question of who's actually paying the biggest burden of this expense, they want to have more say. They want to ensure that they're on the board. They want to ensure that, that their interests are also being protected. So it's not necessarily a one size fits all, but I think although we've had a lot of difficulty within the context of Johannesburg, where we went from legislated SIDS in 2015, which was with our previous legislation, which has since been repealed, to voluntary management initiatives now, there have been some that have really managed to survive and some that have thrived, really, because what it has meant is we really had to hone in on our value proposition. We really had to be able to answer to the people who are paying to say, you pay X, this is what you get in return, this is the value that you see. And I think in the context of an increasingly dysfunctional municipality where we're seeing decreased service levels from the city, in a number of those CIDs, it's become a necessity. And Lusanda was speaking to how a lot of their engagement with property owners is to encourage, that there is some formalized structure, that there is, support of a district or identifying districts as preferable spaces for investment. Because the reality is, in the context of Johannesburg City, and where we are not getting service delivery, the SID or the VMI, Voluntary Management Initiative, is the only point of service delivery. It's the only service delivery we're getting in some areas. We'll see it in our spaces where we've got cleaners, they're there every day, they're cleaning the bins, they're replacing the liners, they're dealing with the illegal dumping. And it means that a pick-it-up cleaner who is meant to be allocated to that space sees our cleaner, crosses the street and goes for tea. So the reality is that there is value in urban management. And part of the most critical piece of that is that you have whatever that resource is dedicated to your new neighborhood, dedicated to your community. And you as a collective neighborhood community structure are saying, these are the things that are important to us. These are the things that we think we really need to emphasize, whether that be security, cleaning. And in some areas, it's actually just cleaning, because security is quite an expensive exercise to undertake. Lusanda referred to our transport improvement district that we have operating within the inner city, and that's a really small district. And that literally it has been about the fact that we have piles of waste daily accumulating within that space because there is no dealing with the illegal dumping. The traders aren't managed, there's nothing. And it's literally just for those property owners to say, how do we deal with the waste? How do we at least solve that one problem? And it doesn't mean that there's not other things we want to do. Doesn't mean that there aren't other priorities that we need to address. But we've said that that is the most critical thing for us, just from a survival perspective, to be able to get into our buildings, to be able to have some level of conversation of getting tenancy in those spaces. So I do really think that urban management has a place. I think realistically, within the context, particularly of Gauteng, it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all. The SRA isn't necessarily an answer for a number of spaces. And that's really why, from a GPMA, so the Gauteng Precinct Management Association, what we're engaging with from a dialogue perspective is to say, what else can work? What is the national enabling policy or legislation, which really just starts to say, these are bodies that can be recognized for partnership. So if it's saying, let's say the Sandton CID as an example, they've done incredible partnership projects with the city, whether it be Adopt a Cop programs where they're sponsoring certain resources for JMPD, or the traffic light project, which has gone everywhere across the city. That was started in the Sandton CID. That started because there are existing relationships there. How do we enable that? How do we make that more common? And I think part of what Gary had referred to from the bureaucracy of the city is that there are silos. There are these things happening in pockets, in isolation. And what an urban management initiative can then do is help bridge that gap. We find very often we are the one facilitating, the conversations between different departments of the city. Whether that be right or wrong, that's not the point. It's just saying that's the reality of what's happening. We're very often saying, how can we help engage? How can we help make these 2 points meet? And the fact that we have an interest in our particular neighborhood succeeding, the fact that we have, we're motivated to make those things work, means that we're going to sustain it. And where you have change in politics, change in policies, change in governance, that inevitably deteriorates the ability of a space to be sustainable. Where if we do have urban management, if you do have a structure and neighbors, community committed to making those things work, you at least know that there's institutional memory. You at least know that from 1 year to the next, someone's going to continue to pass that baton. And completely agree, you can get fatigue. You can get areas where people just, you get freeloaders who decide that they're going to put their hands up and it's no longer sustainable for them. But it is something that is working within our space with varying degrees of success. But the reality of it is that I think what is increasingly common and what is increasingly necessary is that you do need to be looking at your neighborhoods and you need to have one voice. So whatever your boundary is, whatever your definition is, you need to be able to go to the city, go to the municipality to say, we are a collective, and this collective is represented as a non-for-profit company or an NPO or an NGO, whatever the structure is. But you then have some bargaining power to work with the city. You can then say, it's not just me that I'm talking on behalf of. This is something that's important to my neighbors, to my community, and start to have engagements with them in that way. And I think it is nuanced, and we're going to have to tap into lots of different things to make things work in an increasingly crumbling governance space. But there are conversations that are being had around how do we enable this? How do we make it more sustainable? And I think I've run out of time, so I'll leave us to address more of the items in the questions.
Yeah. Thanks, Michaela. That was great. Thank you for those insights. Sure, so many battles, so many fronts. Where do we start sometimes? Just hearing what you're explaining, that one group, they've got one matter they've got to deal with. Sure. So I'm going to move on to some questions. I think this question is for Lusanda. How has the increase in work policies, such as this work from home policies, affected your stock availability of former commercial properties? I think that really comes from the whole COVID kind of period. Lucinda?
Yeah, I think obviously that created the issue of office buildings being more and more available, and that's not helping when you have empty buildings, especially in inner cities. You run the risk of them being hijacked. But when, for instance, Anglo moved out of the CBD in Joburg, they put a plan together to sort of try and get some management process and hand over to sort of civil society types and education group. I think some collaboration with vets to just get that, because it's a huge precinct, that or building, to get that handover done efficiently. So the availability of stock has increased, but unfortunately, we are in a high interest rate environment. Inflation is an issue. So while stock might be available, there aren't always many takers who are willing to invest currently in those conversions. But we still see business coming. People are now looking more at sort of suburban areas instead of the inner city, much because of now this interest of people to sort of live a little bit away from the inner city core. But, this inner city is still holding its own. I think that in Joburg, unfortunately, these, events that happened recently with the Usindiso building burning and 77 people dying, Bree Street exploding, etc., also contributed to a little bit to the sort of nerves that are in the market. But I think inner city investors who've been there for at least since we've been around are still taking on available stock and investing in it. But from an affordable point of view, affordable housing point of view, we haven't seen much impact on occupancy rates. So, buildings are still well occupied, collection rates are still sort of holding their own. So that portfolio still performs relatively well in spite of all these issues. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, it does. And I think I'm just going to bring you to the next question. In case of urban decay and things like hijacked buildings, is there a mechanism to force the city to hand over their properties to commercial buyers, developers, to maintain them and refurb them? I think you partially spoke to the question about, good planning management if you're kind of leaving a building. But is there a mechanism in place? I know in Durban, for instance, that there isn't, but maybe there is, but it doesn't really function extremely well. So if you could just kind of tell us about the issue of dealing with hijacked properties.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of government-owned buildings that are not well managed and are dysfunctional, and some hijacked. The Florence, for instance, comes to mind, next to Constitutional Hill there. And the Johannesburg Property Company, which is the city entity that's responsible for assets owned by the city, has tried a program of trying to release these buildings to private sector investors to purchase and convert and repurpose. But that process, at least in my view, hasn't been successful. I know they've tried it twice. We haven't, as an investor in the inner city of Joburg, with over 2 billion invested in the city of Joburg, we haven't managed to finance one building out of that program because the release process was complex. It wasn't clear, how these investors are selected to get handed over these buildings. I think there was one that we looked at, and that hadn't really. It hasn't succeeded from where I stand. So the process of trying to release stock, I think, in the inner city, if the city could look at the same, process that they tried back in the day, the Better Buildings or Bad Buildings program, where they would release a building for a rand, collaborate with you, with private sector players, on a partnership to say, how do we deal with existing occupants together? I think that worked much better. But, obviously, city has a tendency of trying to I don't know, reinvent the wheel when they had something that was quite successful. I'm still saying they need to look at that program. I think it was quite successful. A lot of social housing stock that happened back in the day with Johannesburg Housing Company, Cope Housing Association, etc., came out of that successful Better Buildings program. And I'm not quite sure why there's been this need to try and refocus it by JPC. My view is that that hasn't been successful.
Yeah, I think that was one of the questions that I was going to lead to, but I think you've answered it about kind of having what forums exist to really have these discussions with municipalities, and forums that do exist, they're not that effective, and I guess that differs from municipality to municipality, and really personality to personality probably as well.
Yeah.
I'm gonna just ask. I've got a question here, and I think I'm gonna probably put this to all of you. Really, I mean, Lucinda, if you want to go first, and then Michaela on this. It's really on bylaw enforcement. You all mentioned how needed it is. How do management districts or community associations get accountability here and use precinct management to make this happen? So does precinct management make bylaw enforcement easier? And I think Gary might even be able to answer this. So we'll start with you, Lucinda, go to Michaela, and then Gary on this question.
I think Michaela and Gary might be better suited to answer it, but my experience is that not necessarily. It can assist in that the private sector players who are involved in a particular CID can report these issues to the city. It then depends on how quickly the city responds. But they themselves can't enforce that by law because they simply don't have the powers to do so. So I've seen that it takes a lot of time trying to build these relationships, with a person within a particular department in the city so that you have a go-to person. But obviously with the political change and all these things over time, it becomes difficult to keep those relationships going continuously over time. And, this always bothers me in that I find that we have an unfortunate system in the country where we rely a lot on what MMCs or politicians have to say, and not so much continuity with the executives, the accounting officers who are appointed on a contract and being paid to provide a service, and that they need to be the ones that account and hold these relationships. But for some reason, when there's a new council that comes, a relationship that you've had with a particular person within a particular department usually just dies. I'm not sure how one works around that. But no, I think they can't. Private sector CIDs can't enforce bylaws on their own. They can report and follow up, and yeah.
Michaela?
Yeah, so I think the reality is, as Lucinda's saying, we don't have mandate. So that's one of the biggest challenges that we have as CIDs. And that's why for us, part of the conversation from the GPMA side is saying, what are the enabling policies, programs, relationships that can give the CIDs essentially a proxy mandate to an extent? So we have it in certain contexts where I'll use the Retail Improvement District as an example. We have a large area where informal traders have regularized trading spaces, let's call that. And as the CID, that is technically a bylaw function. The ensuring that they're complying to the rules, they're trading what they're supposed to trade, that the environmental health conditions are being adhered to. That is a management role that needs to be performed. And we as the CID provide that oversight. We can't find them. So we then rely on JMPD or economic development to come and do their blitzes and their programs to ensure that there's enforcement. But the fact that we have a day-to-day presence there means that that area is better managed, where there are areas where we don't have that in place, because there's an understanding and there's a relationship that's been built with those traders, with those people who are potentially would infringe on those bylaws, because they're part of the solution, they're part of that community, they get value in being in those things as well. So although we don't have a legal authority to do things, we have workarounds, we have relationships, as Lucinda's saying. It's a lot of grind. It's a lot of continuously establishing those relationships with the sector commanders from SAPS or the sector commanders from JMPD, and been able to call on them to assist. And the reality is, particularly within Johannesburg, we have the issue of the city keeps speaking about, block by block, getting the basics right, and the fundamentals of those aren't necessarily translated to those who are doing the job. Part of that is administratively, we have a lot of people who, a lot of positions that are in acting. So we have an acting chief of police, we have acting roles rather than people being appointed to get the job done. So we're dealing with an incredibly difficult space from a governance perspective, particularly in the context of Johannesburg. And there's a lot of instability and uncertainty with coalition governments, and people changed. I think within this past mayoral term, we've had to reintroduce ourselves 6 times because we've had a new mayor, we've had a whole new suite of people that we have to deal with. But the fact that the districts are there has meant that there is at least day-to-day continuity. Although I cannot legally stop that car from parking illegally, we can talk to that driver and say, look, you're on a red line, you're not allowed to be parked here. And then I can phone the JMPD 100 times that day to come and tow that vehicle. So there is some degree of control that's created by the districts being there. We are reliant on the necessary authorities to come to the party as well. But because we have resources on the ground, that is a fight that it's part of our day-to-day and what we're doing within those environments. And it's not an easy win. It is a lot of grind and a lot of attention that needs to be paid to that. But we do see results in our spaces because we've got the availability of resources that are dedicated there. And I think it does also go to one of the questions that are within the space. In general, from a depot level, from your JRA depot or your JMPD officers, they really do like the support that they get. In those areas, they know that they've got backup. They know that they've got other people who are trying to help them get their job done. And there was a question as to whether there's resentment, from municipal entities when we're trying to do their work. Are we stepping on their toes? And for the most part, the nature of how we engage with them is, how do we help you? It's not, we're here to do your job. We don't have the authority to do your job. We can't do this without you. What is the support that we can give so we can have more effectiveness? Because remember, it counts on their scorecard. So at the end of the day, you need to find the mechanism to try and get those types of people to work with you and to want to support the work that you're doing.
Thanks. And Gary, your view
Yeah,
on
I'll be
this?
brief. I mean, I think Michaela's, both speakers have covered it well, but I think Michaela's spoken, essentially made my point. And I think that the key thing about a place-based organization is precisely that, is that its focus is on the space, whereas a municipality is organized by function. So if you're talking about bylaws relate to vagrancy in parks, traffic, trading, illegal property development, speeding, illegal parking. Those are all. So they span right across the city functions, who are organized to cover the entire eThekwini or entire Joburg. So they're not necessarily paying attention to the violation that's happening around the corner, whereas the place management organization is doing exactly that. So I think, to get enforcement, somebody's got to report it, somebody's got to follow it up, you've got to have those relationships. And so I think, again, the partnership element comes in. It's a city's job to enforce, but they need, to report from a credible representative organization that's in the place, that's got the relationships, is a whole lot better than, the same old person that phones all the time and complains about the issue. So there's a value, and I think it's a hand in glove situation.
Yeah, thanks, Gary, and thank you, everyone. I think we've reached the end of our allotted time for the session, and I'm really thankful that you've all taken the time here today to come and join us. This topic's been incredibly engaging, and and this webinar will be on our website in the next 24 hours. If there are some questions we haven't got to, we will send them to our panelists individually and ask them to get us a response. and then we will send that out as part of our webinar when we post it out on the newsletter to all the people that signed up today. If you live in the city of Johannesburg, please visit www.joburgcan.org.za to get updates on the work we are doing in South Africa's biggest city. And as you can hear tonight, there's quite a lot of work that needs to be done. And also, if you live in, obviously, for the rest of the country and on a national basis, we have www.can.org.za, where we develop tools and resources aimed at helping communities across the country. And this webinar is one of those tools and one of those resources that you can rely on in the coming weeks when you find it online, and obviously engage with it in your own time. The submissions, or I'm going to ask Gary hopefully to share his presentation with us, and so we can make that available to everyone as well. So please be on the lookout for that. So without further ado, my name is Jonathan Erasmus. Please join us for our next webinar, which will be the end of next month. We'll be talking to neighbourhoods that are taking the initiative on a voluntary basis to try and make their areas more attractive. And there'll be more information on that webinar in due course. But otherwise, thank you very much, everyone. Have a wonderful evening, and thank you for your time. Thanks. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye.